The day Olive Gentry rode into Caldwell, Kansas on a mule that looked nearly as tired as she did, the whole town seemed to hold its breath not out of welcome, but out of the particular cruelty of curiosity that small towns reserve for strangers who carry their suffering too openly on their faces. It was the spring of 1878, and the cattle trails were beginning to fill again with the sounds of lowing herds and dusty drovers, with the smell of leather and horse sweat, and the distant promise of money changing hands. Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a gate between the wild and the civilized, a town that prided itself on its roughness while secretly wanting something better. The main street was nothing more than a wide wound cut through the prairie, lined with false-fronted buildings that tried to look taller than they were. There was a general store, a livery, a saloon that went by the name of the Silver Spur, a church whose congregation was smaller than the saloons, and a land office that had grown fat on the dreams of settlers who had not yet learned what Kansas could do to a person. Olive rode in with everything she owned tied to the back of the mule in a canvas sack that had seen better decades. She was 29 years old, though she looked like someone who had experienced 40 years of weather compressed into fewer. She had dark hair the color of creek water in autumn, brown eyes that were steady and watchful, and hands that showed she had not spent her life in idleness. She was not broken, not quite, though she had come very close to it. She had the kind of face that had been pretty once and would be pretty again if circumstances allowed, which they had not for some time. Her husband, Daniel Gentry, had died 11 months earlier. He had not died heroically. He had died of a fever that started in his chest and moved outward, claiming him slowly over the course of 3 weeks while Olive sat by his side in their small homestead outside of Wichita and tried every remedy she knew, which were not enough. They had been married 6 years. They had a son, Thomas, who was 7 years old and who had his father's ears and his mother's stubbornness, and who was at that moment sitting behind Olive on the mule with his arms wrapped around her waist and his face pressed into her back, asleep despite the rocking gait of the animal. After Daniel died, the bank had moved quickly. There had been a loan on the homestead, a loan Daniel had taken out during a bad drought year and had not managed to repay before the fever took him. Olive had tried to manage it. She had sold what she could, worked the land herself through the summer, hired herself out to neighbors for washing and mending, and still it had not been enough. The bank had been polite about it, which was somehow worse than if they had been cruel. A polite man had handed her a piece of paper in October, and by November she had been out of the only home Thomas had ever known. She had spent the winter with a cousin in Wichita, a woman named Bertha who was kind but already stretched thin with 4 children of her own, and a husband who drank more than he should. By March, Olive had understood that she could not stay there, that she was wearing out her welcome not through any fault of heart but through the simple arithmetic of too many people and not enough space and money. She had heard, through the kind of conversation that happens in dry goods stores and church basements, that a cattle outfit east of Caldwell was looking for reliable help. A cook, possibly. Someone to keep books. The details had been vague, but vague was more than she had, so she had packed her canvas sack, settled Thomas on the mule behind her, and ridden west. She pulled the mule up in front of the general store because it seemed like the sort of place where a person could ask a question without being laughed at outright. She helped Thomas down first, then climbed down herself, her legs stiff from the ride, and tied the mule's lead to the hitching post. Thomas was rubbing his eyes and looking around with the unfiltered interest of a 7-year-old, who had not yet learned to be afraid of new places. "Stay close," Olive told him, and he nodded with the gravity of a child who understood that this instruction was serious. Inside the store, which smelled of tobacco and dried beans and the sweet rot of overripe apples, a man with a large mustache and ink-stained fingers looked up from behind the counter. His name, as Olive would learn, was Mr. Pulver, and he was the kind of man who knew everything that happened in Caldwell and a good deal of what happened outside it. "Afternoon," he said, in a way that made it a question. "Good afternoon," Olive said. "I was told there might be work available at one of the cattle operations outside of town. I was hoping you might be able to point me in the right direction." Mr. Pulver studied her for a moment with the open assessment of a man who saw strangers come through his town regularly and had developed strong opinions about their prospects. "You talking about the Harlan spread, or Cutter's place over on Bluff Creek?" "I honestly don't know the name," Olive admitted. "I heard it was a large outfit. Someone in Wichita mentioned a foreman named Hale." Mr. Pulver's expression shifted in a way that was hard to read. "That be the Double H second largest spread in the county. Vernon Hale runs it for old Gerald Haverford, who's mostly in Topeka these days on account of his gout." He paused. "It's a working cattle ranch, ma'am. Hard country out there." "I'm familiar with hard country," Olive said, and the evenness of her voice seemed to settle something in Mr. Pulver's mind, because he gave a short nod and told her to take the road east out of town, go 4 miles until she crossed a creek with a willow tree on the south bank, and then follow the fence line north for another 1.5 miles. She thanked him, bought a penny candy for Thomas from her last remaining coins, and went back out into the afternoon light. The ride out to the Double H took the better part of an hour at the mule's unhurried pace. The land was beautiful in the way that Kansas land sometimes was in spring, before the summer heat arrived to bleach everything gold and brown. The grass was green, and the sky was enormous and very blue, and red-tailed hawks drifted overhead in slow circles. Thomas had woken up fully by this point and was asking questions about the birds, and whether there were rattlesnakes in the grass, which there were, though Olive kept this information general and nonspecific. She found the creek with the willow tree exactly where Mr. Pulver had described it, and followed the fence line north until the land opened up, and she could see the ranch buildings spread across a low rise. There was a main house, solid and unpretentious, built from wood and stone. There were 3 long bunkhouses, a cook shack with smoke rising from the chimney, a large barn, several corrals, and a network of fenced pastures that stretched out in every direction, populated with cattle that grazed in the unhurried way of animals who did not yet know they had an appointment in Abilene. Several cowboys were visible working around the corrals, and when Olive rode through the open gate, a few of them looked up with the same quality of assessment she had received in the general store, though with less subtlety. She kept her chin level and her eyes forward. "Looking for the foreman," she said to a young cowboy who was leaning against the fence post watching her with undisguised curiosity. He was maybe 19, with a spray of freckles across a sunburned face. "Mr. Hale's over at the south pasture," the boy said. "I can fetch him, or you can wait at the cook's shack." "I'll wait," Olive said. She helped Thomas down again, tied the mule, and went to wait at the cook's shack, which was warm and smelled of coffee and beef stew. An older Mexican man with a thick gray braid was working at the stove, and he glanced at her and then at Thomas and said, without any preamble, "You want coffee?" "Yes, please," Olive said, and the gratitude in her voice came out more raw than she intended. The cook, who told her his name was Ernesto, poured 2 cups and then found a biscuit for Thomas, who accepted it with the kind of polite solemnity that made Olive's chest ache because she knew he was hungry and had been for longer than she wanted to think about. She had finished about half her coffee when the door opened and a man came in. Olive had expected a ranch foreman to be older, gruff, perhaps thick around the middle, in the way of men who had graduated from physical labor to overseeing it. Vernon Hale was none of those things. He was 34 years old, though she would not know that for some time. He was tall without being imposing about it, broad-shouldered in a way that suggested actual work rather than display, with dark hair that curled slightly at the edges where it met the collar of a flannel shirt that had been washed many times. His face was deeply tanned, lean, with a jaw that carried a few days of dark beard and gray eyes that were, this was what she noticed first, and was surprised by, genuinely thoughtful. Not calculating, not appraising in the way she had become used to from men who saw a widow and made their various calculations. Just thoughtful, as if he were a person who took the world seriously. He knocked the dust from his hat against his thigh, looked at Olive, looked at Thomas, looked at Olive again. "Mrs.," he said. "Gentry," she said, and stood. "Olive Gentry, I was told you might be in need of help. A cook, perhaps, or someone for bookkeeping. I can do both." She paused. "I have a son. He's 7. He won't be in the way." There was a moment of quiet. Vernon Hale looked at her steadily, without embarrassment, the way a person looks when they are making a real decision rather than a polite one. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. "Wichita, most recently. Before that, a homestead east of there. My husband died last spring." She said it plainly because she had found that plain was better than soft when it came to certain facts. Soft invited pity, and pity was the thing she could least afford. "I'm sorry to hear it," he said, and the thing was, it sounded like he meant it and not like he was performing condolence. "Are you the one I should speak to about work, or is there someone else?" She asked because she did not want to sit here being measured if the answer was going to be no and could have been delivered through a third party. "I run this ranch day to day," he said. "Mr. Haverford, the owner, trusts my judgment on personnel." He turned his hat in his hands once, twice, a gesture she would come to recognize as the thing he did when he was thinking. "We have a cook, as you can see, but Ernesto's been struggling with his back and the men have been eating poorly because of it. I've been meaning to find someone to assist him." He paused. "The books are another matter. I manage them myself, but I'm better with cattle than with numbers, and I know it. The spring count is coming up and I could use a clear head with a pen." "I'm good with numbers," Olive said, "and I can cook for a crew this size. I've done it." Vernon glanced at Thomas, who was eating his biscuit with complete concentration. "The boy, he'd stay with you." "He would. He's quiet and he does what he's told." She hesitated, then added, "I know this is unusual. A woman with a child at a cattle ranch. I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Hale. I'm asking for work. I'll earn whatever I'm paid." "I don't doubt that," he said, and he said it with such straightforward certainty that she felt something loosen slightly in her chest, something that had been pulled very tight for a very long time. "I don't have a spare room in the house," he said, "but there's a storage room in the back of the cook's shack that's been used for lumber. We could clear it out. It's small, but it's weather-tight. You and the boy could have it." "That's more than I came here expecting," she said honestly. He looked at her again with those gray, thoughtful eyes. "You asked only for work, Mrs. Gentry." "That's all I asked for," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, and something in his voice shifted very slightly, not dramatically, but in the way that a door opens when it's been stuck, "Well, I might have a little more than that to offer. But we'll start with the work and see how things settle." She wasn't sure what to make of that, but she was too tired to think about it carefully and too grateful to worry, so she just nodded and thanked him. And that was how Olive Gentry came to the Double H Ranch in the spring of 1878. The storage room was exactly as promised: small, weather-tight, and currently full of lumber. 3 of the younger cowboys, including the freckled boy whose name was Pete, cleared it out in about 2 hours with the kind of cheerful industry that young men produce when they want to make a good impression, though on Olive or on each other she wasn't entirely sure. Someone produced a rope cot and a straw mattress. Someone else found a second, smaller cot for Thomas. Ernesto contributed a braided rug and a lamp with a clean chimney, and by evening the room was cramped but livable, and Thomas was asleep on his cot with his boots still on, while Olive sat on her own cot and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into night, the cattle in the distance, the horses shifting in the barn, the low conversation of men on the bunkhouse porch, and felt, for the first time in nearly a year, that she might actually survive this. She started work the next morning before dawn. Ernesto, who turned out to be 61 years old with a back that had been complaining since a horse fell on him 2 years previous, was visibly relieved to have help. He taught her the rhythms of cooking for 30 men in large batches, the proportions, the timing, the things the cowboys would complain about and the things they wouldn't. She learned quickly. By the end of the second day, she had taken over the breakfast and lunch preparations entirely, leaving Ernesto to manage the dinner stew, which he guarded with the proprietary pride of a man whose self-respect is invested in a single recipe. Thomas, meanwhile, discovered that a cattle ranch offered approximately unlimited entertainment for a 7-year-old. He was everywhere, watching the cowboys work, asking questions about horses with the relentless curiosity of the very young. The cowboys, with the rough tenderness that men who spend most of their time away from families sometimes show toward children, were patient with him. Pete took him fishing in the creek one afternoon and came back with 6 catfish and a child who smelled terrible and was happier than Olive had seen him in months. Vernon Hale was present without being intrusive. He ran the ranch with the quiet competence of someone who had been doing it long enough that most things had become automatic, but who still paid close attention because he understood that attention was the thing that separated good operations from disasters. He rose before the rest of the crew, was last to bed, and in between moved through the days with an unhurried purposefulness that Olive found herself noticing more than she strictly needed to. He brought her the account books 3 days after her arrival. They were sitting in the small office just off the main house, a room that smelled of wood smoke and leather, and he spread the ledgers open on the desk with the slightly apologetic air of a man presenting something he knows is not his best work. "I've been keeping them myself since the last man Haverford sent out in December," he said. "He was a bookkeeper by trade, and he lasted 6 weeks before he went back to Topeka." There was no judgment in his voice about this, just the simple notation of a fact. "I know the numbers are right, but the organization leaves something to be desired." Olive sat down and opened the first ledger. The numbers were right. She could see that immediately. Every figure was accurate, every column summed correctly. But the organization was genuinely chaotic, entries made in whatever order they had occurred to him rather than any system, cattle costs mixed in with supply costs mixed in with payroll. She could see him trying to build a structure and not quite having the vocabulary for it. "How long until the spring count?" she asked. 3 weeks, he said. "I can have this sorted in 4 days, she said. "If you can sit with me for an hour tomorrow morning and explain your system for categorizing expenses, because you have a system, it's just not written down anywhere." He looked at her with that expression she was beginning to recognize, slightly surprised, as if he had expected to have to explain more to justify more. "All right," he said. "First thing tomorrow." He showed up at first light the next morning, when she was in the middle of getting breakfast on for the crew. She told him to sit at the table near the window and she would be with him in 20 minutes, and he did, without comment, and drank his coffee and watched her work. She was aware of him watching, not in an uncomfortable way, but in the way of someone who is paying genuine attention, and she kept her focus on what she was doing and let the awareness sit quietly in the background. When she was finished and the crew was eating, she wiped her hands on her apron and came to sit across from him with a clean sheet of paper and a pen. They worked for 2 hours. He explained how he thought about the ranch's expenses, not in accounting terms but in practical ones, the way a man who knows cattle but not ledgers thinks about money, and she translated it as he spoke, building the categorical framework he had been trying to construct intuitively. He was a quick study. When she showed him how a properly organized ledger worked, he understood it immediately and then was quiet for a moment with the look of someone who has just been shown a tool they didn't know existed but immediately recognizes as useful. "You're good at this," he said. "My father kept books for a mill," she said. "He taught me. He said figures were honest, which he considered a virtue because most things weren't." Vernon smiled at that, a slow and genuine smile that changed his face in an interesting way, and Olive noticed it and then looked back at the ledger, because noticing things about Vernon Hale was not something she had come here to do. The days fell into a rhythm. Mornings were cooking and the gradual progress on the books, which Olive worked on in the late afternoons after the noon meal was cleaned up. Thomas went to bed early, and she stayed up with the lamp burning, reorganizing entries and reconciling figures, and she found that she was good at this, really good, in a way that had not had anywhere to go for the past several years because she had been too busy surviving to use it. Vernon began stopping by the cook shack in the evenings after the crew had eaten and the lamps were low. At first, he came with specific questions about the books. Then the specific questions became shorter, and the time he spent at the table with her became longer. They talked about the ranch, about the cattle market, about the way the trail drives were beginning to change as the railheads moved, and the long drives became shorter. Olive found herself engaged in these conversations in a way she had not expected. She had not realized how much she had missed talking to someone as an equal, as a person with opinions worth hearing. One evening, about 2 weeks into her time at the Double H, he asked her about Daniel. "You don't have to answer that," he said quickly, reading her expression. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry." "No," she said. "It's all right." She was quiet for a moment, gathering the things she wanted to say into the right shape. He was a good man. He worked hard and he meant well and he loved Thomas. He just wasn't. We weren't. She stopped. "I think we were both trying to build something and neither of us knew quite how, and then he was gone before we figured it out." Vernon was quiet, listening in that complete way he had. "I loved him," she said, "but I think I was also lonely sometimes inside it. And I don't know what to do with both of those things being true at the same time." "They can both be true," he said simply. She looked at him. "You're a more thoughtful man than most people expect a ranch foreman to be." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "My mother was a school teacher," he said. "She would not have allowed otherwise." "Is she living?" "She died 4 years ago. She was the best person I've ever known." He said it without sentiment, just as a fact, the way he said most things. "What about your father?" "Left when I was 8. My mother raised me and my sister alone." He said this with the same quietness, but she heard something underneath it, the particular compression of a thing that had shaped a person without defining them. "Your sister, married in Denver. She has 3 children and a husband who builds furniture and apparently makes her very happy. I went a visit 2 years ago." He paused. "She kept asking why I hadn't settled down. I told her I hadn't found the right reason to." The room was very quiet except for the night sounds outside and the low creak of the building. "That's an honest answer," Olive said. "I try," he said. She looked down at the ledger in front of her, at the neat columns of numbers that had taken her a week to bring into order, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but the possibility of it, which was something different and maybe more important, because possibility was what you needed before anything else could grow. She told herself to be careful. She told herself she was a widow with a young son on a cattle ranch, and her situation was precarious enough without adding complication to it. She told herself that Vernon Hale was her employer, more or less, and that she had learned enough about the world to know that men in positions of authority over women's livelihoods were not always what they appeared to be. She told herself all of this, and then she kept talking to him anyway, because he was the kind of person who made sense of the world when he spoke, and she had been a long time in a world that had not made much sense. The spring count arrived in the second week of May, and the Double H became a place of organized chaos, with cowboys pushing cattle through chutes, the smell of branding smoke thick in the air, dust everywhere, and Vernon at the center of it all, directing the operation with the focused calm of someone very good at something they have done many times. Olive watched him from the fence one afternoon while the beans simmered, and Thomas sat beside her asking about the different cow brands, and she was watching the way he moved through the work, the economy of his gestures, the way the crew responded to him, the trust built into the relationship between a foreman and his men, and she felt something she recognized belatedly as admiration, which was the kind of feeling that could become something else if you weren't paying attention. There was an incident on the third day of the count. One of the older cowboys, a man named Darcy Alcott, who had been with the Double H for several years, and who had, in Olive's observation, a particular problem with the presence of women in spaces he considered his, came into the cook's shack midday when she was alone and made a remark that was technically vague enough to dismiss, but was not, in fact, ambiguous at all. He was not threatening, not physically, but he was deliberate. Olive set down the pan she was holding, looked at him, and said in a voice as flat and cold as a stone in January, "Mr. Alcott, I am going to say this once. I am here to work, I am doing my work, and any arrangement beyond that is not something I am interested in. If you speak to me that way again, I will inform Mr. Hale." Alcott's expression cycled through several things in quick succession and settled on a sulky withdrawal. He left without another word. She did not tell Vernon that evening. She told herself it was because it had been handled, and it had been. But 2 days later, Pete, who missed nothing despite appearing to be entirely focused on his coffee, mentioned it to Vernon in a way that was clearly intended to ensure the foreman heard about it. Olive found this out because Vernon came to find her that evening with a set to his jaw that she had not seen before. "Pete told me about Alcott," he said. "I handled it," she said. "I know you did," he said. "That's not why I'm angry." He was quiet for a moment. "I should have made it clearer from the beginning that you were here under my protection, that I wouldn't tolerate that. This is not the kind of operation where that kind of thing is accepted." He looked at her directly. "I'm sorry." "You didn't do anything wrong," she said. "I didn't do enough right," he said. "There's a difference." She was struck, not for the first time, by the way he held himself responsible for things within his sphere. It was not guilt-ridden or performative. It was the genuine moral seriousness of a person who understood what responsibility meant. "What will you do?" she asked. "I already spoke to Alcott," he said. "He'll be moving on at the end of the month. He's been looking for a reason to go to Texas, and I've given him a good one." He paused. "I want you to know that you're not just here under sufferance, Mrs. Gentry. You're valuable to this ranch and to me, to the operation. The books have never been better, and Ernesto is half a decade younger since you took over the mornings." There was something careful about the way he had said "to me" and then corrected himself, and she heard it, and he heard her hearing it, and for a moment they were both very aware of the silence in the cook's shack and the sound of the evening wind outside and the particular quality of lamplight. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." He put his hat back on. "Good night, Mrs. Gentry." "Good night, Mr. Hale." He was almost out the door when she said, before she had quite decided to, "Vernon." Just his name, he stopped. "You don't have to keep calling me Mrs. Gentry if we're speaking privately. Olive is fine." He turned back, and the slow, genuine smile was there again. "Good night, Olive," he said. After he left, she sat for a long time at the table with the ledger open in front of her, and did no work whatsoever. June came, and with it the heat that was the honest price of Kansas spring. The cattle trade out of Caldwell was active, and Vernon was frequently in town for business, meeting with buyers and trail bosses, and occasionally he asked Olive to come along to assist with the contract figures. The first time he asked, she arranged for Ernesto to keep an eye on Thomas and climbed up onto the wagon seat beside Vernon, and they drove into town together with the comfortable companionability of people who have spent enough time in each other's presence that silence is not awkward. Caldwell, in the heat of trading season, was a different creature than the sleepy town she had ridden into in April. The streets were busy with cowboys who had finished drives and were spending their trail wages with determined efficiency, with cattle buyers in suits that looked wrong on the landscape, with merchants whose faces had the pleasant flush of good business. There was noise and dust and occasional disorder, and underneath it all, the perpetual scent of cattle that no wind ever quite cleared. Vernon moved through it all with the practiced ease of someone familiar with the terrain. He introduced her to the people they encountered as the Double H's bookkeeper, straightforwardly, without apology or excessive explanation, and she appreciated this more than she could have said. He did not treat her as an anomaly or as someone who needed to be explained. He treated her as a professional, which she was. They had dinner at a restaurant on the main street after the business was finished, the kind of meal that came on actual china plates, and Thomas ate his chicken and dumplings with the focus of someone determined to do justice to the experience. Olive watched her son and felt the complicated emotion of parenting, the love braided through with worry, always the worry, the awareness of how fragile everything was. But sitting here in this restaurant, with a meal she had not cooked herself and the sound of her son making small sounds of contentment across the table, and Vernon across from her cutting his beef with the unhurried attention he gave to everything, she thought that this, whatever this was better than anything she had been able to imagine 4 months ago. "He's a good boy," Vernon said, nodding at Thomas. He said it simply, the way he said things that he meant. "He is," Olive agreed. "He's better than he has any right to be, considering what this year has put him through. Kids are more resilient than we give them credit for," Vernon said. "Or they bend in ways we can't see until later." He paused. "My mother used to say that the bending is what made a person, that it wasn't the things that broke you but the things that didn't. Your mother sounds like she was remarkable. She was difficult and funny and deeply intelligent," he said. "She would have liked you." Olive looked at him. He was looking at Thomas, not at her, but there was a color along his jaw that had not been there a moment ago. "Would she?" Olive said quietly. "Yes," he said, and then he looked up and their eyes held for a moment, and then Thomas said, "Can I have the last dumpling?" And the moment passed into the ordinary flow of the evening, but it left something behind. The way water leaves the ground changed after a good rain. On the drive back to the Double H, Thomas fell asleep against Olive's side almost immediately, and she shifted to accommodate his weight without thinking, the automatic adjustment of a mother's body to a child's, and for a while they rode in the dark quiet with only the sound of the horses and the vast spread of stars above them. "Can I ask you something personal?" Vernon said eventually. "You can ask," she said. "What do you want? Not the work, not the practical things, I mean in your life. What do you actually want, if the world were less complicated than it is?" She was quiet for a moment, because no one had asked her this in a very long time, not since before Daniel died, not since before the bank, not since before the long winter of managing and surviving. She had gotten so used to wanting only what was achievable that she had almost forgotten how to want the other things. "I want Thomas to grow up somewhere he knows he belongs," she said at last. "I want to do work that matters. I want," she stopped, started again. "I want to be known by someone, not just my usefulness, the actual inside of me." He didn't say anything for a long time. The horses walked steadily. Stars moved overhead. "That doesn't seem like too much to want," he said finally. She looked at his profile in the dark, the strong line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders. "What do you want?" she asked. He was quiet even longer. "The same things," he said. "More or less." The 4th of July brought a celebration in Caldwell that the whole county attended, a band, food stalls, a horse race that Pete entered on a paint mare and came fourth in, which he would not stop discussing for the following week. Vernon had given the crew the day off and driven Olive and Thomas into town in the wagon, and the three of them spent the day moving through the celebration together, and it felt, to a degree that Olive found somewhat alarming, natural. Easy in the way that things are easy when they are right. Thomas attached himself to Vernon partway through the morning, asking about the horse race, and Vernon answered every question with the same patience he brought to everything. And at some point, Thomas's hand found Vernon's and stayed there while they walked, and Vernon didn't make any particular gesture about it, just walked with the boy's hand in his, and Olive saw this from slightly behind them and felt something in her chest do something she could not entirely control. She looked away and looked at the celebration around her, at the bunting and the crowds and the enormous Kansas sky blue above it all, and she thought about Daniel, which she did whenever she felt something pulling her forward, out of habit, out of guilt, out of the need to locate herself in relation to her grief. She thought about what she had told Vernon, that she had loved Daniel and had been lonely inside it. She thought about whether grief was the right reason to refuse something good, or whether it was the easier reason. She thought about Thomas's hand in Vernon's hand, and what her son needed from the world now that his father was gone. She did not arrive at any conclusions. But she stopped looking away. That evening, after Thomas had fallen asleep in the wagon on the way home, Olive and Vernon sat on the bench seat in the quiet, and Vernon said, "I've been meaning to tell you something." "All right," she said. "I asked Haverford when I wrote him last week about making the bookkeeper position permanent," he said. "Full-time, with proper wages, not what I've been paying you out of the household account." He paused. "He agreed, if you want it." She felt something fill up in her throat. "That's very good news." "There's something else," he said. I am aware that your situation here is what it is, and that I have a position of authority over your employment, and I would never want you to feel." He stopped, and she could see him being careful with the thing he wanted to say. "I would never want you to feel that anything I might want from you personally was a condition of your employment, because it isn't. Your work is good, and your position is secure on that basis alone." She turned to look at him. The prairie was dark around them, lit only by stars. "What is it that you want from me personally?" she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. He looked at her, and in the starlight his gray eyes were dark and very serious. "To court you," he said, "properly, if you're willing." Olive Gentry, who had ridden into Caldwell in April on a tired mule with a canvas sack and a sleeping child and nothing else left, sat very still in the dark and felt the world shift slightly under her, the way it does when something that has been moving in one direction for a very long time begins, slowly and irrevocably, to change. "I'm a widow with a 7-year-old, she said. "I know," he said. "I'm a 34-year-old ranch foreman who has never been good at explaining himself to people he cares about. We've both got our circumstances." A laugh came out of her, unexpected, genuine, and she pressed her hand over her mouth and then took it away because there was no reason to hide it. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. "You can court me," she said, "properly." The word properly made him smile, and she could see it even in the dark, and she thought that if she had to locate the precise moment when she understood she was going to love this man, she would have said it was this one, though she would have been wrong. It had been building for weeks, slow and steady like water rising, and this was just the moment she admitted to herself that she was already submerged. Courting, Vernon Hale's style, turned out to be as unassuming and genuine as the man himself. He was not a grand gesture person. He did not bring flowers purchased from a store or write elaborate letters. What he brought was his full attention, which was, Olive discovered, a rarer and more valuable thing than most romantic gestures people made a fuss over. He sat with her in the evenings and asked about her day and meant the question. He learned that she loved the dawn, when the light came across the Kansas prairie in long horizontal shafts of rose and gold, and he made a habit of being at the cook shack door at dawn, ostensibly for coffee, and they stood together on the doorstep and watched it, 2 cups in their hands, Thomas still asleep inside, and they talked or they didn't, and both were fine. He taught Thomas to ride a horse properly, spending Sunday afternoons in the small paddock with the boy and a gentle quarter horse named Moses, patient in the way of someone who understands that the point is not the riding, but the relationship between the rider and the animal. Thomas was a natural, though Olive privately suspected that every mother thought her child was a natural at whatever the man she was beginning to love was teaching him. In mid-July, a letter came from Gerald Haverford in Topeka. Vernon read it, and then came to find Olive in the office where she was working on the summer accounts, and he set it on the desk in front of her without comment. Haverford was selling the double H. The letter was businesslike and not unkind. His health was poor. His sons, who lived in the East, had no interest in cattle ranching, and had been after him for years to liquidate his Western holdings. He had found a buyer, a man named Carver from Missouri, who would take possession in the fall. He told Vernon that he had spoken highly of him to Carver and had no doubt that a new Foreman arrangement could be worked out, and that he would be generously compensated for his years of service. Olive read the letter twice. Then she looked up at Vernon, who was standing by the window with his hat in his hands doing the turning thing once, twice. "What will you do?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he said. "Work for Carver, maybe," or he stopped, "or look at other options." "What other options?" He came and sat down across from her, the way he had that first afternoon in the cook shack, and leaned his forearms on the desk. "There's land available east of the creek," he said. "Quarter section, good grass, water rights. I've had my eye on it for 2 years. I have enough saved to put down on it if I wanted to start something." He looked at her steadily. "Smaller operation, not 30 head of crew, but mine." The weight of what he was saying and what he wasn't quite saying settled in the room between them. "You've been thinking about this," she said. "I've been thinking about it more since April," he said, and the way he said it left no ambiguity about what had changed in April. "Vernon," she said, "I'm not asking you anything right now," he said quickly. "I'm telling you what I'm considering. He paused, and she could see him being careful with the words the way he was careful with everything. "I want you to know what I'm thinking, because it matters what you think. I think," she said slowly, "that you are a man who has worked other people's land for a long time and that you should have your own. And I think that if you're considering something that involves a bookkeeper," she said, "I happen to know a good one." He looked at her for a moment, and then he laughed, a real laugh, full and genuine, and she had not heard him laugh like that before, not fully, and it was one of the better sounds she had ever heard. They were interrupted by the door opening and Pete coming in with a question about the east pasture fence line, and the moment dispersed into the workday, but it left its mark on both of them. August was when Olive finally accepted that she was in love with him, and accepted it not with the dramatic revelation of a moment, but with the quiet settling of a thing that has been true for a while, and is now simply acknowledged. She was washing up after the evening meal, and he came in for coffee the way he did, and she handed him the cup without him asking, and he took it without thanking her because the exchange had become that automatic, that embedded in the ordinary, and she looked at the side of his face as he drank and thought, with complete clarity, "I love this man." She did not say it immediately. She was not the kind of person who said things without being sure of the ground beneath her. But that night, after Thomas was in bed, she sat with Vernon on the bench outside the cook shack door in the warm August dark, close enough that their arms were touching, and she turned to look at him. "I want to say something," she said. He looked at her. "I came here in April not expecting anything except to survive," she said. "I had gotten very good at just surviving, at making sure Thomas was fed and that there was a roof and that the next thing that needed doing got done. I had stopped thinking about anything beyond that." She paused. "You have made me think beyond that again. I want you to know that." He was very still. "I'm not rushing anything," she said. "I know there's a great deal that's uncertain. The ranch selling, your plans, all of it. But I want you to know she found the word, what's grown in me. Since April." He set his coffee cup down on the bench beside him and turned to face her fully. The August stars were enormous overhead, and the air smelled of dry grass and cattle and the particular cleanness of a prairie evening, and he looked at her with the full weight of his attention, which was considerable. "Olive," he said, and her name in his mouth had a quality that she felt somewhere behind her breastbone. "Yes," she said. "I have not been able to think about much besides you since about 2 days after you arrived," he said. "I have been trying to do the appropriate thing, which is to take this slowly and not make you feel." "I don't feel any of the things you're worried about making me feel," she said. "I feel none of those things." He reached out and took her hand slowly, carefully, giving her every opportunity to redirect it, and she did not redirect it, and his hand was warm and large and weathered, and it held hers as if it had always been going to do this. "I intend to buy that land," he said. "I intend to build something on it. And I intend, if you're willing, to ask you a question sometime in the not-too-distant future." His voice was steady, but she could hear what was underneath it. "But I want to earn the right to ask it first." "You've been earning it for 4 months," she said. "Not long enough," he said. "Not for a question that matters that much." She squeezed his hand, and they sat in the dark holding hands like two people who had come a long way through difficult country and were resting in a good place. And it was, she thought, a very fine thing. The news that the Double H was being sold reached the crew and spread through the ranch, and then through the county with the speed particular to small communities where information travels on the same wind as dust. Carver, the Missouri buyer, came out in late August to look at the property, and Olive watched him walk the range with Vernon and two of his own men. He was a compact, shrewd-looking man in his 50s who said little and appeared to be calculating constantly behind his neutral expression. He made her uneasy in a way she could not entirely articulate, though she was honest enough with herself to admit that she was not a neutral observer. Vernon told her that evening that Carver had offered him the foreman position at a higher salary than he currently made. "But," she said, hearing the one clearly. "But it's not what I want," he said. "It's someone else's operation, and it'll always be someone else's operation. I've been someone else's foreman for 12 years. He said this without bitterness, just as a fact. "I'm 34 years old." "You're going to buy the land," she said. "I made an offer yesterday," he said. "The owner accepted it this morning." She felt a surge of something, joy, pride, something in the complicated family of those emotions. "Vernon, I'll be leaving the Double H at the end of October when Carver takes over," he said. "I'll start building in November before winter sets in. It'll be rough the first year." He looked at her. "I've spoken with Carver about whether he'd need a bookkeeper going forward. He said he has his own arrangement and would not be needing one." This landed in the room between them. Olive looked at her hands on the table. "I see," she said. "I want you to come with me," he said. "Not as a hired hand." He stopped. "I know I said I wasn't going to ask yet, but circumstances have a way of forcing a man's hand." He looked at her with complete seriousness. "I want to marry you, Olive. I want to build that ranch with you. I want Thomas to grow up on land that belongs to us, that we've made something of. I know it won't be easy. The first years will be hard. But he paused again, and in the pause she could hear the weight of everything he meant. "I love you," he said. That's the simplest way to say it, and it's true. The lamp between them burned quietly. Outside, the prairie night was its usual enormous self. Olive sat with her hands folded on the table and looked at this man who had given her work and then given her something far better than that, who had held her son's hand at a 4th of July celebration and taught him to ride a horse and sat with her at dawn over 2 cups of coffee and made the world make sense again. "Thomas is part of this," she said. "He's not a complication or a consideration. He's my son." "I know," Vernon said. "He's also one of the best people I've met in recent memory, and I've met a good number of people." He said this without performance. "He would be mine if you'd allow it. I would raise him as my own." Olive breathed slowly. "He needs to have a say," she said. "He's 7, not a piece of furniture. He has an opinion about this." Vernon nodded. "Of course." "If he says yes," she said, "then my answer is yes." Vernon looked at her. "You're sure?" "I am," she said. "I am more sure of this than I have been of anything in a very long time." He stood up from the table and came around to her side, and she stood to meet him, and he held her face in both hands gently, the way you hold something valuable, and she looked up at him, and he kissed her, slowly and carefully, and she kissed him back, and it was nothing like surviving, it was nothing like managing and enduring and getting through. It was the opposite of all of that. It was something beginning. The conversation with Thomas happened the next morning. Olive brought him to sit at the table with her and Vernon, while Ernesto diplomatically found reasons to be elsewhere, and she was honest with him in the way she had always tried to be honest with her son about hard things. "Mr. Hale has asked me to marry him," she said. "That would mean we would live on the new land he's buying, and it would be the 3 of us. What do you think about that?" Thomas looked at Vernon with the unblinking assessment of a 7-year-old who takes questions seriously. Vernon did not fidget or look away. He returned the look steadily. "Do you want to marry my mother?" Thomas asked. "Very much," Vernon said. "Because she is the most capable and honest and good person I've met," Vernon said. And because she makes the mornings worth getting up for, and because I love her. Thomas considered this. Do you like fishing? He asked. I do, Vernon said. Do you like horses? I like horses a great deal. Will we have horses on the new ranch? We'll have horses, Vernon said. You'll have your own when you're ready. Thomas looked at his mother. I like Mr. Hale, he said. I've liked him for a while. Olive felt her throat tighten. Is that a yes? Thomas nodded. Yes, but I think you should call him something other than Mr. Hale if you're marrying him. What should I call him? She asked. Thomas looked at Vernon with the same serious evaluation. What do you want me to call you? Vernon was quiet for a moment. Whatever feels right to you, he said. There's no rush on that. Thomas nodded solemnly and went back to his breakfast, and Olive and Vernon looked at each other over his head, and she thought that she had never understood what it meant to be truly seen until this man had looked at her and seen not her situation, not her widow's grief, not her usefulness, but the actual inside of her, exactly as she had said she wanted. They were married in Caldwell on the 14th of September, 1878, by the minister of the small church whose congregation had recently grown, partly because the reverend had proven to have good judgment about people. It was not a large ceremony. Ernesto came, and Pete, and a few of the crew who had been with the Double H long enough to feel that Olive Gentry was one of their own. Mr. Pulver from the general store attended, having developed a proprietary warmth toward Olive since the day she had walked into his shop and asked him where to find a foreman named Hale. Olive wore the best dress she owned, which was not new but was clean and pressed, and a deep blue that someone later told her matched the Kansas sky in September. She had washed her dark hair and worn it pinned up in a way she had not bothered with for months, and the transformation, not dramatic, just the simple restoration of a person who had been given back the space to care for themselves, was visible enough that Pete stared until the cowboy next to him elbowed him. Vernon wore a suit that fit him well, which surprised no one who had been paying attention, because a man who does everything else deliberately could certainly be counted upon to wear a suit correctly. He was waiting at the front of the church when she came in, and when he saw her his expression did something that she recognized from the night they had talked on the bench, the particular look of someone who is feeling more than they have words for, and she thought it was one of the finest things she had ever seen. Thomas stood beside Vernon during the ceremony. This had been his idea, not anyone else's, and he had announced it with such matter-of-fact certainty that no one had suggested otherwise. He stood straight and serious and very proud, and afterward he shook Vernon's hand with tremendous solemnity, which made Ernesto cry, which he denied for the rest of his life. The reception was at the Silver Spur, whose owner had offered the back room and was enough of a businessman to know that goodwill in a community was its own currency. There was music from a fiddle and a guitar, and dancing, and food that Ernesto had been preparing for 3 days with what his bad back allowed, and what Olive had helped with on the condition that she was not doing so out of habit but out of genuine desire, which she was. Vernon danced with her 3 times, which in Caldwell in 1878 was a clear and public declaration, and she danced with him with the particular abandon of a person who has stopped being careful and has decided to be joyful instead. Thomas fell asleep in a corner sometime around 9 o'clock and did not wake up for the drive home, which was not back to the Double H, but to the small house in Caldwell that Vernon had rented for the month of transition, a temporary place, a threshold space. She woke up the next morning in a room that was not the cook shack storage room, with the sound of Vernon making coffee in the kitchen, and Thomas's even breathing from the small room next door, and the September light coming through the curtains, and she lay still for a moment and inventoried what she felt, which was something she had been doing at various intervals since April, usually finding something complicated and uneasy and hard. What she found this morning was simple. She found something that sat solidly in her chest and did not shift or qualify itself or come with conditions. She found happiness, which she had been working her way back toward for a long time and which had finally arrived. Vernon had bought the land east of the creek and had begun preparations for the first structures. They spent October working the Double H through its transition to Carver's management, Vernon fulfilling his professional obligations to the end, because that was who he was, while spending every available hour planning what they would build on their own property. In the evenings, they spread maps and drawings across the rented kitchen table and talked about what they needed first and what could wait and what they truly wanted. And Olive discovered that building something together was its own form of intimacy, different from but equal to the other kinds. Carver's transition was completed by the 1st of November. The Double H crew had mostly scattered. Pete had gone north to try Montana. Ernesto had gone to live with his daughter in Santa Fe, which he had been putting off doing for 3 years, and which was clearly the right thing. The parting from Ernesto was brief and contained, which Olive understood was the way he handled things he felt strongly about, and she accepted the short, fierce embrace he gave her at the stage stop and told him to take care of his back. They moved onto their own land on November the 3rd. The house was not finished. It was a single large room with a fireplace and a roof, functional but plain, with walls that would be extended come spring. There was a barn, rougher still, and a small corral. Everything smelled of new lumber and pine sap and cold air. Thomas ran the perimeter of the property and came back breathless with the accounting. 4 horses, he said. There are already 4 horses, Mama. 2 of them are for working cattle, Vernon said. One's for me, one's for you. Thomas looked up at him. Mine, he said. When you're ready, Vernon said. We agreed. Thomas looked at the horse, a small, steady bay mare with a kind eye, and then at Vernon, and then he said simply, I'd like to call you Pa if that's all right. There was a silence on the November prairie, the kind of silence that holds something very still. That's more than all right, Vernon said, and his voice was quiet and not entirely steady, and he put his hand on the boy's shoulder, and Thomas leaned into it with the complete trust of a child who has decided where he belongs. Olive turned away and looked at the unfinished house, which was her house on her land, and thought of the mule, of Wichita, of the canvas sack, of the banker's polite face, of the cook shack storage room, of Ernesto's coffee, of dawn over the prairie, of Vernon's hands turning his hat, of a man in a flannel shirt who had looked at her with thoughtful gray eyes and seen not a problem to be managed but a person worth knowing. The first winter on their own land was exactly as hard as Vernon had said it would be. The house was cold until they got the second fireplace built in January, and supplies were tight, and there were weeks when the work was unrelenting in the way that frontier life could be, a constant pressure of physical and practical demands that left little room for anything else. Olive's hands, which had been rough when she arrived in Caldwell, became rougher still. Vernon worked from dark to dark, and came in every evening carrying the cold from outside with him like a coat he hadn't taken off. Thomas attended school in Caldwell 3 days a week, riding in on a borrowed horse, and came home full of information about his classmates and the geography lessons, and the way the teacher, a young woman from Ohio who had come west for reasons she didn't discuss, had very strong opinions about penmanship. But there were also evenings when the work was done, and the fire was high and Thomas was asleep, and they sat together at the table with the lamp, and the account spread open before them, or the drawings for the spring expansion, and the quiet of the house was a warm and inhabited thing, not the blank quiet of emptiness, but the particular full quiet of people who are comfortable with each other and with their life. These evenings were worth everything else the winter cost them. In February, during a week when a hard freeze had locked the world in ice, and the cattle huddled in the lee of the windbreak they had planted, Vernon woke up at 2 in the morning to the sound of something wrong with the barn. He came back 20 minutes later with news that one of the mares was in labor early, and Olive pulled on her coat and her boots without being asked and went with him, and they spent the rest of that night in the cold barn with the laboring horse, taking turns and working together with the practical intimacy of people who have moved past every formality. The foal was born just as dawn was breaking, a small dark thing that staggered upright with the determination of new life, and Vernon looked at Olive across the foal's back with an expression she had never seen on his face before, a kind of naked wonder, as if he had forgotten for a moment to be steady and was simply present in what was happening. Thomas appeared in the barn doorway shortly after, still in his night clothes and cowhide boots, and stared at the foal with enormous eyes. "Is it a boy or a girl?" he demanded. "A boy," Vernon said. Thomas named the foal Atticus, for reasons he could not fully explain but which he was firm about, and Atticus became his particular charge, and by spring the two of them were inseparable. Spring arrived as springs do in Kansas, in a rush of green and rain and wind that dismantled winter's work in a matter of weeks. The house expansion had begun by mid-March, and by April, exactly 1 year since Olive had ridden into Caldwell on a tired mule, the house had 3 proper rooms, a full kitchen, a covered porch that looked west toward the evening sky, and a flower bed that Olive had planted along the south wall because she had decided she was done living in places that didn't have flowers. She found out she was expecting in late April. She sat with the information for 3 days before she told Vernon, not out of fear, but out of wanting to understand it herself first, to locate it within the larger shape of this life she was rebuilding. When she told him, she said it quietly over breakfast, and he went very still the way he did when something mattered, and then he reached across the table and took her hand and held it, and she could see everything he was feeling moving through him in that way he had, contained but very present. "Are you happy about it?" she asked. "I am," he said. "Very." And then, with the characteristic quiet that was his form of emphasis, "Are you?" "Yes," she said, "though I'm also terrified." "That seems about right," he said. Thomas, when told, was interested in the philosophical implications for some time. He wanted to know where the baby would sleep, whether it would be a boy or a girl, and whether, if it was a boy, he could teach it to fish. All of these questions seemed to him of equal importance. The summer of 1879 was a good one by the standards of what it needed to be. The cattle operation was small but viable. Vernon was methodical about expanding it without overreaching, using the account books Olive maintained as the honest measure of what was possible. He had hired one hand, a steady older cowboy named James Briggs, who had a bum knee from an old riding injury, and who rode with a slightly listing quality that didn't affect his work. James lived in a small room in the barn, was quiet and competent and genuinely fond of Thomas, and became the kind of presence on the property that felt less like an employee and more like a fixture. They were known in Caldwell by now Vernon Hale and his wife, who kept the books for half the operations in the county because word had gotten out that she was good, and who had a son who was the best young horseman anyone had seen in some years, and who were building something solid on the land east of the creek. They were not wealthy, not by any measure, but they were established, and the difference between that and the spring of the previous year was so vast that Olive sometimes stopped in the middle of an ordinary task and felt the vertigo of it. The baby arrived in November of 1879, in the house on their own land, attended by the doctor from Caldwell, and by a neighboring woman named Mrs. Crane, who had done this many times and was calm and efficient, and said nothing unnecessary. Vernon was in the house for all of it, in the room, which was not typical for the time, but he was not the kind of man who removed himself from things that were happening to people he loved. It was a boy. They named him Samuel, for Vernon's grandfather, who had been a decent man by all accounts, and also because Thomas had suggested it, which Olive thought mattered. Samuel arrived in the world with a great deal of indignation about his circumstances, a shock of dark hair, and eyes that in the first days looked gray, but which gradually settled into the deep brown of his mother's. Thomas regarded Samuel with the grave attentiveness of an older sibling who has accepted a large responsibility. He reported daily on Samuel's developmental progress with a thoroughness that made Vernon laugh. "He tracked my finger today," Thomas announced one morning at breakfast, when Samuel was 3 weeks old. He definitely followed it. He's 3 weeks old, Vernon said. He's advanced, Thomas said firmly. Vernon looked at Olive over Thomas's head, and there was that expression again, the one she had first seen in the barn with the foal, that unguarded quality of a man who is deeply happy and knows it and is not hiding it. He gets that from your side, Olive told Vernon. The advancement or the certainty? The certainty, she said, and they were both smiling. And it was morning on the prairie with the light coming through the kitchen window the way it always did, warm and honest and gold. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was cold but manageable, and they managed it together, which made it entirely different from the cold winters before. Samuel grew and declared his opinions on the world loudly and often. Thomas rode Atticus in the paddock through even the coldest days, which Olive watched from the kitchen window with a combination of maternal anxiety and genuine wonder. James Briggs proved his worth a dozen times over in the difficult months, and Vernon made sure he was compensated accordingly, which James accepted with the dignified restraint of a man who is not used to being treated fairly and is not quite sure what to do with it. In the spring of 1880, Olive was working on the books for 3 additional operations in the county: a dry goods operation, a livery in Caldwell, and the new land office that had opened up east of town. She worked from the house, mostly in the mornings while Samuel slept, and the income it brought in was substantial enough that they were able to add proper fencing to the east pasture and put down on 2 more breeding cattle. The 4th of July came around again, and they drove into Caldwell for the celebration, which was larger than it had been 2 years ago because the town was growing with the cattle trade. Thomas was 9 now, taller with his father's, with Daniel's ears, and, increasingly, a look in his eye that reminded Olive of Vernon, which was something she had not expected, and which made her understand something about how children absorb the people who raise them. At the celebration, Thomas entered a horse race for boys under 12 on Atticus and won, which surprised no one who knew him, and which he was entirely modest about in exactly the way that his stepfather was modest about things, by saying simply that Atticus had been the better part of the partnership. Vernon was standing beside her watching the finish of the race when he put his arm around her waist, and she leaned into him, and they stood watching Thomas accept his small prize ribbon with that touching solemnity, and Samuel was in Vernon's other arm, 9 months old and watching everything with enormous brown eyes and the focused gravity of an infant who takes things seriously. "I keep thinking," Olive said, quietly so that only he could hear, "about the mule." He looked at her. "The mule." "I rode into Caldwell on the most tired mule I have ever seen," she said, "and I had 5 cents in my pocket and a canvas sack and no idea what I was going to do." "I know," he said. "Pulver told me eventually," she laughed. "Of course he did. He also told me that you asked for work very directly without any of the usual apologetics and that he was impressed by it." "I was too tired for apologetics," she said. Vernon pressed his lips to her temple briefly, easily, the way people touch each other when they have been doing it long enough that it is instinct. "I'm glad the mule made it to Caldwell," he said. "I sold it to a farmer outside of town," she said. "In May of last year he was very happy with it." "I hope it got some rest," Vernon said. "I imagine it did," she said. "It had earned it." They stood in the July sun, the 4 of them, 5 if you counted Atticus, who was tied to the fence line nearby looking pleased with himself. And the town moved around them, the celebration continuing in its annual declaration that whatever the country was, whatever it had cost and was still costing, people were here and alive and willing to mark the fact of it. Olive thought about Caldwell in April of 1878, about the particular quality of having nothing left, about what nothing left actually felt like from the inside. Not dramatic, mostly, just an absence, a stripped-down feeling, the sensation of having been reduced to your most essential self with nothing extra to protect you. She had been afraid then, underneath the practicality, afraid in a way she had not admitted even to herself. Afraid that this was what remained of her life, this managing and surviving, and that the other things, the inside things, the things that made a person more than their circumstances, had been lost somewhere in the grief and the debt and the cold winter in Bertha's crowded house. They had not been lost. They had been dormant. They had been waiting for the right conditions. Vernon had been the right conditions. Not because he had rescued her. She had been very clear with herself about this. Because she had not needed rescuing, not exactly. She had needed working conditions and fair wages and the chance to prove what she could do. He had given her those things first, and everything else had grown from there, from the equality of two people who respected each other's competence, and then discovered that respect, given time and honesty and those particular Kansas dawns over 2 cups of coffee, could become something very much more. She turned her face up to the July sun and felt it on her skin and thought that the world was on balance, and despite everything it could do to a person, capable of this, of turning toward you again, of offering the particular combination of circumstances and character, and will that added up to a life worth living, to more than survival, to the actual thing. Samuel reached out from Vernon's arm and grabbed a fist full of Olive's hair, which was a habit he had developed, and which she suspected she was going to have to address at some point, but not today. Today it was fine. Everything was fine. "Ow," she said mildly, and detached his fingers, and he looked at her with those grave brown eyes, her own eyes in his little face, and then he leaned forward with the determined head-first momentum of an infant and pressed his forehead to her cheek, which was his version of a kiss. "He's affectionate," Vernon said, watching. "He's aggressive," she said. "There's a distinction. He gets that from your side." "Absolutely not," she said. Thomas came back to them with his ribbon, and handed it to Vernon for safekeeping, and then launched into a detailed analysis of the race that lasted for the better part of 15 minutes. And Vernon listened with complete attention, asking the right questions at the right moments. And Olive watched them and thought about what this man had meant when he said that first evening that he had more to offer than just the work. She understood now the fullness of what that had been, not a promise of security or rescue, but the offer of himself, of his steadiness and his attention and his willingness to build something together, really together, in the full sense of that word. She had accepted it without quite knowing she was accepting it. That was all right. Some of the most important agreements you ever made were the ones where the terms became clear only in retrospect. The years moved forward as years do, carrying the people inside them along with a combination of intention and accident. The ranch grew, modestly but steadily, because Vernon was not a man who reached past his capacity, and Olive's books never lied to either of them about what the capacity was. By 1882, they had a proper crew of 3, a larger barn, a second pasture across the creek that Vernon had always had his eye on, and a house that had expanded room by room as need and means allowed, until it was a real house, with a parlor and a porch and shelves full of books that Olive had been acquiring from every source available to her, because she had decided that her children would grow up in a house that had books. Thomas, at 11, was already a horseman of real ability, and had begun helping with the cattle work on weekends, which he approached with the combination of enthusiasm and seriousness that characterized everything he did. He had his father's, Daniel's, quiet steadiness and Vernon's deliberateness, and Olive sometimes thought that he was the best of 2 men, and she was grateful for both. Samuel at 2 was a force of nature in the small body, determined and loud and deeply affectionate, following Vernon around the property with the devoted intensity of a small dog, which Vernon bore with visible delight. He called him Pa from the very beginning, having heard Thomas use it, and this was simply how it was, and it was right. In the summer of 1882, Olive discovered she was expecting again. She told Vernon on the porch in the evening, and he went still the same way he always did, and then he smiled the slow, genuine smile. "Nervous?" he asked. "Less so this time," she said, "though I reserve the right to revise that." "Noted," he said. "I want a girl," she said. I haven't said that out loud before. I know, he said. I've been saying it for you internally for some time. She looked at him. Have you? I thought a girl who had your stubbornness would be genuinely frightening and therefore interesting. My stubbornness, she said. Your magnificent stubbornness, he said, and she laughed and leaned into him. And the prairie evening was doing its thing with the colors, going gold and rose and deep violet at the horizon, the way it did every night without fail, and she thought that it was one of the great reliabilities of her life, that and the man beside her. The girl arrived in February of 1883. They named her Clara, for Vernon's mother, which had been his suggestion, and which he made with a quiet emotion she recognized as the kind that ran very deep. Clara came into the world with less drama than Samuel, and with an expression of considering assessment that seemed to belong to a much older person. Thomas was immediately and comprehensively smitten. Samuel was suspicious for approximately 1 week, and then claimed her as his own in a way that suggested he had always intended to be fond of her and was just setting his terms. Vernon held Clara for the first time with the same quality of wonder he had worn in the barn with the foal, and he held her and looked at Olive and said, simply and completely, "Thank you." "For Clara," Olive said. "For everything since April of 1878, he said. "For getting on that mule, for riding into town, for asking for work." She looked at him from the bed where she was resting, this man who had offered her more than the work and had meant every word of it. "You had something to do with it," she said. "I had the good sense to say yes," he said. "You had the good sense to say yes," she agreed, "and to mean it." Clara made a small sound in his arms, and he shifted her with the instinctive ease of someone who has done this before, and he looked down at her with an expression of such complete and undefended love that Olive felt tears come to her eyes, which she would later attribute to the general exhaustion of childbirth, and which was also entirely something else. That evening, when Clara was sleeping and Samuel had been put to bed by James Briggs, who had become a kind of unofficial uncle to the children and who submitted to this role with gruff pleasure, and Thomas was doing his lessons at the kitchen table, Vernon sat beside Olive on the bed with his back against the headboard and her head on his shoulder and Clara in the crook of his arm. "Tell me about the mule," he said. "What about the mule?" "The whole story. From the beginning." "I've never heard all of it." So she told him from the beginning: the homestead, Daniel's illness, the bank, Bertha's house, the winter, the rumor in a dry goods store about a foreman named Hale, the ride across the spring prairie with Thomas asleep behind her. She told it plainly, the way she told everything without dramatizing it, and he listened the way he listened to everything, completely and without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I keep thinking about who you were when you rode through that gate," he said. "What that had cost you to get there, everything you'd been through." "I was holding on by a thread," she said honestly. "You didn't look it," he said. "You looked like someone who had decided to handle it." "I had decided to handle it," she said. "That's different from being all right. I had decided to handle it because the alternative was not handling it, and Thomas needed me to handle it." "And now," he said. She considered the question seriously, the way she took all real questions seriously. She thought about the ranch outside the window, the cattle and the horses and the fenced pastures, the house that had grown room by room, the books on the shelves, the account ledgers that told an honest story of a life that was building. She thought about Thomas at the table with his lessons and Samuel asleep in his room and Clara in her husband's arms, and the man himself, warm and solid and entirely present. "Now I am actually all right," she said. "Not handling it, actually all right." He pressed his lips to her hair slowly. "Good," he said. Outside, the Kansas night was doing what it always did, enormous and cold and full of stars, indifferent to human particulars in the way that vast things are, but also there, undeniably there, the same sky over the tired mule arriving in 1878, and the house full of sleeping children in 1883, the same stars that had been overhead on the bench outside the cook shack when he had taken her hand for the first time. The world did not care about Olive Gentry and Vernon Hale and the life they had made together. But they cared about it, and about each other, and about the children sleeping under their roof, and that, she had learned, was sufficient. That was more than sufficient. That was everything. In the morning, the dawn would come across the prairie in those long rows and gold shafts that she had always loved, and Vernon would be up before the light to start the work, and Thomas would ride Atticus out to check the east fence, and Samuel would appear in the kitchen doorway with his hair standing on end, and an expression of complete certainty about what he wanted for breakfast, and Clara would be awake and ready to announce her opinions on the world. The ledgers would need updating, and the cattle would need tending, and the work of a life would present itself in its complete and ordinary and extraordinary form. And Olive Gentry Hale, who had ridden into Caldwell in the spring of 1878 on a tired mule with a canvas sack and 5 cents, and a sleeping child and nothing else left in the world, would make the coffee and hand the first cup to her husband across the kitchen table, and watch the light come over the land that was theirs, that they had made and kept and built together. And she would feel, not for the first time, not for the last, but as freshly as if it were new, the complete and solid weight of a life that had come back to her in full.